Following the death of King Matthias I Corvinus Hunyadi on the 6th of April 1490, the Diet of the Realm of St. Stephen assembled for a special session to elect a new king. It became very clear very quickly that the vast majority of the estates of the realm did not support Matthias's chosen successor, his illegitimate son John Corvinus. The estates had sworn an oath to make John the next king a year before, but that oath was made to King Matthias, and King Matthias was now dead, and it can be argued that the oath was made under duress. There were several reasons why the estates opposed John Corvinus. They didn't want a continuation of King Matthias's increasingly absolutist and centralizing style of rulership. They had had enough of the violations of the constitutional order, enough of the illegal taxes or taxes at all, enough of the expensive mercenary black army that sucked up most of the realm's revenues, replaced the warrior nobility as the crown's main military force, and was King Matthias's oppressive iron fist against any potential dissent. They had had enough of the reforms, of losing privileges, of the educated commoners and foreigners in the administration, and they had had enough of the hypocrisy. In his last years of rulership, King Matthias was preaching law and order to the realm, while using any and every means at his disposal to bolster the claim of his bastard son. Matthias had given John Corvinus enough land, some of it taken from others, to make him the richest noble in the realm. And as hard as Matthias had worked to legitimize his son, his wife, Queen Consort Beatrice of Naples, worked hard to prevent John's succession. Her main means of doing so did not succeed, even after 14 years of marriage. But she used the resources and position of the Queen Consort to hinder John's prospects, and now, as John's long-standing opponent, she wielded some influence over the succession debate. Another consideration that prevented John's election was that not choosing one of the other candidates could lead to war, on all fronts. The first among the other candidates was Maximilian von Habsburg, King of the Romans and of Germany, Regent of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. Maximilian claimed the throne through the Treaty of Vienna-Neustadt of 1463, signed between his father and King Matthias, which designated Frederick III and his heirs as successors to the realm of St. Stephen in case Matthias died without a legitimate heir. Considering Frederick III was 75 in 1490 and at death's door, Maximilian took up the claim. Maximilian's supporters in the Diet of the Realm of St. Stephen believed that Maximilian, as heir to the empire, would be capable of defending the realm from the Ottoman threat. Maximilian had already provided aid to some of the estates on the Ottoman border, mostly Croatian nobility. That not only provided for the forward defense of Habsburg land, but also made the estates receiving aid more inclined to support Maximilian. But Maximilian was not popular with the majority of the estates of the realm of St. Stephen. Partially due to Frederick III's actions during the mid-century crisis, partially due to the animosity towards Frederick and Maximilian that was encouraged by King Matthias over the last few decades, partially due to the estates viewing the Habsburgs as foreigners who brought nothing but trouble the last time they were on the throne, and partially due to Maximilian exhibiting some centralizing and absolutist tendencies in his dealings with his subjects in Burgundy and the Low Countries. The other two candidates effectively had the same claim to the throne. One was King Wladislav of Bohemia, and the other was his brother Prince John Albert of Poland, both sons of King Casimir IV of Poland-Lithuania. claiming the crown of Saint Stephen through their mother Elizabeth, who was daughter of King Albert von Habsburg of Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, Dalmatia, Croatia, etc., and through their uncle, King Wladislav Jagiellon of Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, Dalmatia, Croatia, etc., who died at the Battle of Varna in 1444. King Casimir IV gave his support to Prince John Albert, in the hopes of spreading the Jagiellon dynasty out and securing a crown for each of his sons. But the estates of the realm of Saint Stephen had other ideas. They preferred King Wladislav of Bohemia. Wladislav was exactly what they were looking for. Since becoming King of Bohemia in 1471, Wladislav ruled in accordance with the will of the Bohemian estates. Or, to look at it another way, the Bohemian Hussite revolt had stripped the crown of much of its property and power, and since Wladislav arrived on the throne with no army of his own, and his territorial rule was limited to Bohemia proper, he was completely and utterly dependent on the goodwill of the estates of Bohemia. Because of this, and since he was very young when he became king, Wladislav adopted a non-assertive style of rulership. When the effort to strengthen the Catholic Church and the crown in Bohemia failed with the Second Defenestration of Prague in 1483, Wladislav did not attempt to assert his authority and dominance and escalate the situation into another civil war. Instead, tensions were calmed, which led to a settlement at the Diet of Kutna Hora in 1485, which brought an end to the Hussite confessional conflicts in Bohemia. This non-assertive nature won Wladislav the approval of the magnates of the realm of Saint Stephen, who it is said wanted a king whose brain they could hold in their hands. Queen consort Beatrice also made background dealings with Wladislav, promising to put her support behind him if he agreed to marry her after his election and coronation. It should also be noted that there was a number of nobles in the realm of Saint Stephen who had acquired property in Moravia, Silesia and Lusatia under King Matthias, after his conquests of Bohemia in the 1470s. After Matthias died, those lands rebelled and declared reunification with Bohemia proper under King Wladislav. So of course those landholders supported Wladislav in order to retain those properties without too much difficulty. All of the reasons mentioned made Wladislav the favorite to become the next king. As it became clear where the wind was blowing, some Hungarian and Croatian nobles sent appeals to Maximilian von Habsburg and Prince John Albert of Poland, asking them to come and seize the throne by force. While inside the realm, John Corvinus, with support of his friend Lawrence of Ilok and the Archbishop of Kalosha, gathered an army and marched for Buda. They were defeated on the 4th of July 1490 by the favored commanders of King Matthias, Stephen Batory and Paul Kinigi. On the 15th of July 1490, the Diet of the Realm of Saint Stephen elected King Wladislav of Bohemia as their new monarch, provided he agreed to sign and swear to coronation documents obliging him to respect the will of the Diet, the advice of the Royal Council, the constitution of the realm, the traditional rights, liberties and privileges of the estates, and to not perpetuate any dangerous novelties that King Matthias had introduced. At the end of July, Wladislav swore to the documents at the border of his realms. Soon after, John Corvinus swore loyalty to the new king. King Wladislav in return allowed John to keep his lands and titles, and appointed him Duke of Slavonia. As Wladislav prepared for his coronation in the autumn, in August of 1490 Vienna opened its gates to Maximilian von Habsburg, who quickly regained control over Lower Austria and Styria, taking back what King Matthias had conquered 5 years before. And in Poland, John Albert prepared to march southwards. On the 18th of September 1490, at Székesfehérvár, Bishop Oswald II of Zagreb crowned King Wladislav Jagiellon of Bohemia as King Wladislav II of Hungary, Dalmatia, Croatia, Rama, Serbia, Galicia, Lodomeria, Cumania, and Bulgaria, with the Holy Crown of Hungary. There were two significant breaks in tradition at this coronation. First, the Archbishop of Esztergom did not perform the coronation. This was because Archbishop Hippolyte d'Este was underage and not fully invested into the office. And he was in Rome. His replacement, the second highest cleric of the realm, the Archbishop of Kalosha, had sided against Vladislav during the succession struggle earlier in the year, while the Bishop of Zagreb was one of Vladislav's prominent supporters, thus was given the honor of performing the ceremony. The second break in tradition at the coronation was the absence of a significant number of members of the Croatian estates, who did not attend the ceremony in protest of the coronation documents, mainly the use of the following phrasing: "The Kingdom of Hungary and all the kingdoms and provinces subject to it." This phrasing disregarded Croatia's status as an equal kingdom to Hungary. The formulation also likely caused dissatisfaction from the estates of Transylvania, though they appear not to have protested as notably as the Croatian estates. This seems to be the first notable occurrence of tensions between the two sisterly kingdoms. In this case, the matter would be resolved fairly quickly, as we shall see. Also, excuse the digression, but sisterly kingdoms is one of my favorite historical terms I've heard used. Soon after the coronation, King Wladislav II married Queen Beatrice of Naples, in a private ceremony officiated by Bishop Tomas Bakac of Győr. After fulfilling his promise to marry Queen Beatrice, King Wladislav, with some legalistic and theological help from Bishop Bakac, issued a statement saying that he had been forced into marriage under duress and requested an annulment from the Pope. One reason for this was to remove Queen Beatrice as a political factor. The other was the fact that she was considered to be incapable of conceiving a child. The proof of the matter was that no child was born in her 14 years of marriage to King Matthias, despite both of them desperately wanting a child. Vladislav's request for an annulment caused scandal across Europe. The Pope was hesitant to grant it, instead dispatching an investigation to the realm of St. Stephen to ascertain the facts, effectively sweeping the matter under the rug for the next decade. After the coronation, another matter arose of a more administrative nature. In the Peace of Olmütz, signed between King Matthias and King Wladislav in 1479, it was agreed that should Matthias die first, as happened, Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia could only be returned to the Bohemian crown after Wladislav paid out 400,000 florins to the treasury of Matthias's successor. Wladislav being Matthias's successor complicated matters. The estates of the realm of St. Stephen, by their interpretation, demanded that Wladislav, as King of Bohemia, pay up, that is, transfer the money from Prague to Buda, and until then they would consider Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia to be administratively Hungarian. The estates of the realm of St. Wenceslas asserted that the transfer of money would be pointless, as it would mean that Wladislav would be giving his own money to himself, and that Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia had automatically been transferred to Bohemia upon Vladislav's succession. Wladislav, for his part, agreed with both sides, effectively solving nothing. But as long as he remained king of both realms, the matter could be delayed indefinitely or until forgotten about. This effectively favored the Bohemian position, as it meant no transfer of money occurred. There were also far more serious things to consider in 1491. Władyslav's brother, Prince John Albert of Poland, invaded from the north and laid siege to Košice, while King Maximilian von Habsburg of Germany advanced from the west. In a fast-paced advance, he captured several castles and Székesfehérvár on his way to Buda. Some Croatian and Hungarian nobles had joined Maximilian, most prominently a few members of the Frankopan family and Lovro of Ilok, while Lovro's old friend, John Corvinus, sided with Wladislav. And just as Maximilian got very close to Buda, he ran out of money. And instead of risking mutiny and a complete loss of his force, Maximilian turned the army around and headed back for Austria. Vladislav's forces followed, recapturing Székesfehérvár and other castles, but stopping at the Austrian border. Maximilian's withdrawal allowed Wladislav to turn his force around and push his brother back into Poland. All in all, Wladislav had secured his throne momentarily. All that he had lost was King Matthias's Austrian conquests. Maximilian and Wladislav met at Pressburg on the 7th of November 1491 and signed a peace treaty. Maximilian agreed to recognize Wladislav as the ruler of the realm of Saint Stephen. In return, Wladislav gave up any claims he had on Lower Austria and Styria. Wladislav recognized Maximilian's right to style himself as King of Hungary, Dalmatia, Croatia, etc. An amnesty was given to all of Maximilian's supporters, and the two reached a new agreement on the succession, in which it was agreed that should Wladislav or his heirs go extinct, the realms of Saint Stephen and Saint Wenceslas would fall to Maximilian and his heirs. This deal was not exactly sealed yet. Wladislav still needed the Diet of the realm of Saint Stephen to approve the treaty. The treaty was very uneven. In fear of continuing the war with Maximilian, Wladislav had given up a lot and reinstated the unpopular succession agreement, without losing a single battle. The Diet was not going to easily accept it without a lot of concessions on the king's part. But that was a problem for next year. A completely different problem surfaced at the end of 1491. The royal treasury was empty. Wladislav was only receiving half the tax revenues of his predecessor. After King Matthias died, many people, especially nobility who insisted on their traditional tax exemptions, began resisting the royal tax collectors, who were assaulted, chased out, locked up, and in some cases killed. Having used up a lot of the money on the usual costs of running the realm and rewarding his supporters and placating his opponents, Wladislav tried to cover the loss of tax revenue by mortgaging some of the royal estates and selling rights to other sources of revenue. But it was still not enough money, because at the end of 1491, the king's mercenary Black Army, which manned the forts and was used to chase off Maximilian and John Albert, had not been paid. And when mercenaries are not paid, they mutiny and begin to raid areas they are charged with protecting. The Black Army's former commander, Paul Kinigi, was ordered by the king to crush the mutiny. It was a relatively easy task, given that the units of the Black Army were disorganized and spread out, but it took several years to completely quell the mutiny. The captured members of the Black Army were shown little mercy. Some are said to have been roasted alive. Some say this was because they were members of the more violent sects of Bohemian Hussitism, but this was also revenge by the estates of the realm for the decades of oppression by the Black Army and all the violations of the traditional constitutional order that it represented. When King Wladislav II ascended to the throne of the realm of Saint Stephen, Bishop John Filipec of Varad told him that his new subjects would need to be forced into obedience with an iron rod. King Wladislav did not appear to have the will nor the means of forging one. As in Bohemia, he depended on the goodwill of the members of the royal council and the Diet of the realm. He would use up a lot of that goodwill very early by having to get them to accept a peace agreement with Maximilian von Habsburg. The reason why this peace agreement was so unpopular was because Wladislav seemed to have given away a lot, especially agreeing to reinstate the Habsburg succession without ever suffering defeat on the field of honor. The fact that the realm was out of money and Wladislav was trying to avoid a multi-front war mattered little to a lot of the members of the Diet, which was summoned into session in February of 1492. As a representative body, the Diet was made up of around 100 to 200 magnates and great prelates, who had the special privilege of being invited personally by the king to attend him at the palace during the Diet. A lot of them were also already members of the Royal Council. There were then several hundred summoned representatives, sent from the Diets of the kingdoms of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, representatives of the clergy from the cathedral chapters and a few select monasteries, representatives of the nobility from the noble municipalities or communities or counties, and the representatives from the free royal cities. The number of representatives varied a lot depending on how many were requested to attend the Diet, but it was usually 2, 3, or 4 per constituency. But the number of invited participants didn't really matter, as they were all outnumbered by the growing tide of hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands, of minor nobles who insisted on their right to represent themselves before their king personally. The reasons for this tide of self-representation will be discussed later in the series, but it was partially the result of a king who was actually willing to listen to the will of the Diet. At the Diet, everyone split into different factions, usually the minor nobility gathering around influential magnates for a variety of different reasons. To get the Peace of Pressburg past the Diet, Wladislav was forced to negotiate with every faction and make many concessions. After reaffirming all of the promises he made in his coronation documents, Wladislav agreed to rid the realm of King Matthias's detrimental and oppressive innovations and novelties, and return it to the good old days of King Charles I Robert, Louis, Sigismund, and Albert. Many of King Matthias's legal and administrative reforms were revoked. The court's administration and tax collection were returned to the control of the nobility. Many taxes were revoked, and immunity from taxation of the nobility and clergy, as guaranteed in the Bull of 1222, was restored. Property seized by the crown during Matthias's reign was to be returned. Measures were implemented restricting the free movement of peasants between estates. Military obligations to the crown were reduced. The king needed consent from the royal council or the Diet to go on military campaign. High office was only to be granted to the magnates of the realm, and the king was not allowed to consult or grant offices or estates to foreigners without approval of the royal council or the Diet. To avoid any mid-century crisis shenanigans, a new law was implemented to safeguard the Holy Crown of St. Stephen. The crown's guards were to be appointed by the royal council, not the king. Wladislav appeased the estates of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia and Transylvania by correcting the earlier controversial phrasing to now read Kingdom of Hungary and the kingdoms of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, and Transylvania, and all the provinces subject to it. The Ban of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia was also issued with an official recognition of the equal status of the estates of Croatia and Hungary. One of the few novelties implemented by King Matthias that survived was the privilege of the Kingdom of Slavonia to only pay half taxes to the royal treasury. This privilege, that had existed for only a few decades, was reframed by the Slavonian estates as an ancient right. Wladislav also acquiesced to the demand that he spend the majority of the year in Hungary, severely limiting his influence on Bohemian affairs. Out of the rest of his 26-year reign over the two realms, Wladislav would only spend around 2 years in Bohemia. The Bohemian estates had to send delegations to Buda to meet with the king, and had to bear with the fact that the king's Hungarian councillors had influence on Bohemian affairs. Without a king in Bohemia, the lands of the Bohemian crown continued a decentralizing trend that started with the confessional divisions and was aggravated by Matthias's conquest. Visible signs of this decentralization was that the estates of the different lands did not meet with each other or take care of any joint business, and, in time, Bohemia and Moravia adopted Czech as their institutional language, while Silesia and Lusatia adopted German. But I digress. The biggest faction at the Diet of 1492 formed around Stephen Zápolya, who gained the support of the majority of the minor nobility by styling himself as their champion. Zápolya himself was a rich magnate whose family rose to prominence under King Matthias. Wladislav gained the support of Zápolya's large faction by appointing him as the new Palatine. After all these concessions, the Diet approved of the king's treaty with Maximilian von Habsburg. Soon after, King Wladislav also reached a peace agreement and then an alliance with his brother John Albert, who had been elected as King of Poland after the death of their father, King Casimir IV. Their other brother Alexander became Grand Duke of Lithuania. Unlike his predecessors, who paid lip service to the Diet and made promises they did not intend to keep, King Wladislav II showed no sign that he wanted to fight this new parliamentarianism. He almost always accepted the will of the Diet, and performed his duties conscientiously. He summoned the Diet into session frequently, and is said to have never missed a single meeting of the Royal Council. Now, the Royal Council officially had around 60 to 80 members, all of them magnates and prelates, but only about a dozen of the most prominent office holders met with the king frequently and handled the affairs of the realm on an almost daily basis. King Wladislav mostly acted as the council's chairman and supreme arbiter if any disputes arose between the councillors. The most prominent and influential of the councillors was the newly appointed chancellor, Thomas Bakach of Erdod, the Bishop of Győr, the one who advised Wladislav on his marriage. As chancellor, Bakach oversaw the administrative machinery of the state and held influence over other offices and positions. He was a highly educated Renaissance man. He was also highly corrupt and nepotistic, which will become a problem in the near future. Speaking of problems, as everything mentioned was going on, Ottoman raids were wreaking havoc along the border. Turnu Severin had been besieged but successfully defended. The defending captain sent 2 carts full of severed Turkish heads to Buda as proof of his victory. In contrast to the situation on the Croatian-Hungarian-Ottoman border, on the other side of Europe, King Ferdinand II of Aragon, king consort to Queen Isabella I of Castile, conquered Granada, pushing the last Muslim ruler out of the Iberian Peninsula, and then pushing out a lot of their new and old subjects. And over the far-flung ocean waves, land was sighted, and the world was changed. Among the concessions King Wladislav made at the Diet of 1492 was the promise to return property taken by King Matthias to its previous owners. One of those disputed properties was the royal fortress of Segni, which was, until 1469, owned by the Frankopan family. Naturally, the family wanted it back. The problem was that the fortress was an essential part of the defensive system, and the men in charge of that section of the defense, Ban Emmerich Derencin of Dalmatia, Croatia and Slavonia, and Duke John Corvinus of Slavonia, refused to hand over the fortress. The conflict escalated in 1493. The Frankopan family were preparing to seize the fortress by force. Ban Derencin was preparing to defend it, and John Corvinus is alleged to have resigned his position over the whole matter. He wanted to maintain his good relationship with the Frankopan family and would go on to marry Beatrice Frankopan in 1496. It's very questionable whether Corvinus really resigned because of this. We know he is no longer Duke of Slavonia in 1494, Another story goes that the dukedom was taken away because the king and council still considered Corvinus to be a threat, as he was proving himself to be a good leader and commander in the position, but I digress. The developing crisis around Sejny was put to a stop in mid-1493 by a significant Ottoman incursion passing through Croatia and into Carinthia and Carniola. Ban Derenčin assembled an army of the Croatian nobility in order to intercept the Ottomans on their way back, when they were tired and carrying loot. The Frankopan family put their pretensions on Sejny aside and joined the army. The Croatian army intercepted the Ottoman force on Krbava Field on the 9th of September 1493. Ban Derenčin decided to fight on an open field, expecting to face exhausted and lightly armed raiders. It turned out to be a more dangerous force. What followed was described as a massacre of the flower of the Croatian nobility, where many scions of the oldest Croatian noble houses either died or were captured. Ban Derenčin himself was imprisoned by the Ottomans. It's said that after the battle he was served lunch, with his son's severed head on the side. The victors also sliced off the noses of the dead. The Sultan was paying a gold coin per nose. The account of the catastrophic defeat on Krbava Field was written according to the survivors, one of whom was Bernardin Frankopan. The blame for the loss was placed on Ban Derenčin, who died in Ottoman captivity. He is accused of stubbornly ignoring the advice of Ivan Frankopan of Cetin and others who died in the battle, that they should ambush the Ottoman raiders in the mountain passes, as was the usual practice. The accounts of the battle appear to exaggerate the material losses. After the battle, the military strength of the Croatian nobility appears to have been more dented than destroyed, but still the psychological effect of the battle should not be denied. The defeat and the intensifying raids across the entire border caused the estates of the whole realm to cry out for aid. Firstly, from their king. But the king had no aid to give. The treasury was nearly empty, the funds that the crown did have were spread thin. To add to that, the king no longer had a strong centralized military force of his own. The Diet, held earlier in 1493, had disbanded what hadn't mutinied of the Black Army, meaning that the defense of the realm was now reliant on the military capability and coordination of the decentralized traditional system of noble banners, and on King Matthias's system of fortresses that was under constant pressure from the raids. The nobility, especially the nobility near or on the border, now had to organize and finance the defense of the realm themselves. All the while, Ottoman raids destroyed their economic base by causing their peasantry to run away. On the one hand, while this was a problem for the large magnate landholders, they could still offer lower taxes and better working conditions and even move their peasants to safer estates further away from the border, and they could acquire more of those safe estates to finance the defense of the endangered ones, like the Croatian magnates were doing by acquiring estates in Slavonija and Hungary. On the other hand, the minor nobility found itself in an existential crisis. They could not afford to offer lower taxes or demand less labor, especially not if they lived on the border. They feared economic ruin if their peasants moved away as soon as they had a chance, leaving for the cities or, far more commonly, going to other estates, making other nobles richer and more powerful. To fan the flames of fear and division, the Sultan sent secret messages to each individual noble along the border, offering a deal. In return for tribute to the Sultan, their lands would be spared from the raids. Since almost everyone got one of these messages, anyone whose land did not get raided was suspected of colluding with the Sultan. All this meant that the nobility began to distrust each other and focused on defending their own lands rather than on a joint defense. With little to no help coming internally, the estates began to openly beg for aid from the outside, an act that would have been considered treasonous under King Matthias but King Wladislav saw as a necessity. Soon after the defeat at Krvava Field, the Croatian Diet sent appeals for immediate aid to Maximilian von Habsburg and Pope Alexander VI, informing them of the Sultan's messages and warning them that if aid was not provided immediately, people would be considering the Sultan's offers. Very soon, Pope Alexander VI provided money and supplies, while Maximilian sent soldiers. Some among the Croatian nobility turned to help from Venice, which hired them as condottieri, paying them to protect Venetian holdings on the Adriatic coast. However, this external support created a dependency on the external benefactors and spread their influence inside the realm. The situation on the border improved somewhat in 1494 and 1495. Paul Kinigi defeated a large Ottoman incursion in the east, while John Corvinus was returned to a position of prominence as the new Ban of Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia. He had some trouble with the estates of Slavonia, who were unwilling to provide reinforcements for Croatia, being far more concerned with their own defense at the time, but the new Ban managed to get them to cooperate. But suddenly, in 1495, Sultan Bayezid II offered peace to King Wladislav. Why? I don't hear you ask. Because in late 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy to claim the throne of Naples, proclaiming that he would lead a crusade against the Ottomans from there. To the surprise of many, his advance through Italy was unhindered. His army was still very strong when he entered Naples almost unopposed in the new year. In early 1495, the Sultan had good reason to fear a possible French invasion, so to free up his forces he offered peace to King Wladislav, which was accepted. Even though peace was declared and the large incursions ceased, the little war on the border, the raids, did not stop, and the realm was in dire need of military and economic reform. Lastly, I have two asides. On the 19th of August, 1493, Emperor Frederick III von Habsburg died, leaving his son Maximilian a united Austria, having technically bought Tyrol from his cousin Sigismund in 1490. And, on the 6th of November, 1494, a new swinging supposed sultanic successor was born to Sultan Bayezid's son Selim, who was named Suleiman. The situation on the Ottoman border required bold, urgent, and decisive action supported by a realm united in common cause, and in 1495 decisive action was taken. King Wladislav II gathered an army and marched down south to force the surrender of Lovro of Ilok, who called the king an ox and conspired against him again. Soon after, Lovro of Ilok submitted to the king in order to retrieve his confiscated estates. Now, Lovro of Ilok was an unpopular troublemaker at this point. Wladislav did not risk anything by using force to deal with him. But King Wladislav couldn't take any other bold, urgent, and decisive action. Firstly, it wasn't in his nature. Secondly, he did not want to get dragged into factional struggles and jeopardize his delicately balanced support structure. This left the urgently needed reform of the realm up to the Royal Council and the Diet of the realm. But the two bodies were divided internally and pitted against each other. The Royal Council was full of rich magnates and prelates, all secure in their positions, all with their own ideas and concerns, who now expected that they would be directing the internal and external affairs of the realm as they saw fit, with the consensus of their own little circle. The problem to that was that the Diet of the realm was outright dominated by the growing number of minor nobles whose concerns were very local, particular, and existential, and they saw most of the magnates on the Royal Council as corrupt threats. This growing, let's call it, movement of the minor nobility was not a phenomenon isolated to the realm of Saint Stephen. When King Maximilian summoned the Imperial Diet of Worms in 1495 in order to raise money to defend against the Ottomans and intervene against the King of France in Italy, he was faced with demands for wider imperial reform, and among them were demands from the minor counts and imperial knights for more representation and protection of their rights against the more powerful estates of the empire. Numerically, the minor nobility was the majority of the nobility, while in Western Europe the nobility numbered around 1 in 100 of the population. As you went further east, the proportion of the nobility in the population increased. In the realm of Saint Stephen, it was around 1 in 25 people. In Poland, it reached around 1 in 10. The reasons for this are tied to population density, legal and cultural particularities around who can even be considered nobility, and how land and titles were inherited. The reasons why the minor nobility was growing angry at this time was that they feared losing their wealth and position in society. They were no longer being completely relied upon for either military or administrative services. Some of those jobs were being taken by mercenaries and university graduates. With new socioeconomic structures developing, they saw more urban commoners and merchants amassing wealth, while even some peasants were becoming richer than some minor nobles. The small plots of land the minor nobility had were becoming economically insufficient. Inheritance was dividing the land up into smaller and smaller parcels between a growing number of people, and others were trying to acquire those plots of land, or the workforce on them, from their weaker neighbors. In the realm of Saint Stephen, the minor nobility feared losing everything. If their peasants fled, they would be forced to either face the humiliation of working their own land, going to beg for employment, or be forced to sell their land and lose their status. So an idea begins to gain greater strength, that most of the legal protections for the peasantry should be done away with, that peasants should be tied to the land they worked for longer, if not forever, and that new taxes on the peasants and serfs should be implemented. What the minor nobility lacked for in wealth and influence, it made up for in numbers and the capacity and willingness to threaten and use violence to enforce their views and achieve their ends. The new parliamentarianism that came with the ascendance of King Wladislav II also gave the minor nobility a strong voice in the affairs of the realm. Sensing opportunity for advancement, Stephen Zápolya became their champion, and with their support the new Palatine. Soon most of the minor nobility's anger was directed towards Zápolya's rivals on the royal council, especially Chancellor Thomas Bakac of Erdod, who became the symbol of systemic failures and corruption. The accusations against Bakac were not unfounded. He was responsible for the appointment of most officials in the realm. Some of them were highly educated young priests and clerics, others were his own kinsmen. Bakac is also accused of bribing people with positions in the Hungarian church. He is accused of taking bribes from Venetian agents. He is also accused of manipulating nobles with no heirs of their own into signing their lands to his nephews. Out of the lines of those nephews would come the prominent noble family of Erdodi. But I digress. Zápolya's anachronistically called National Party had its first big successes at the Diet of 1495. A law was passed that confirmed the right, no, the obligation, of all the nobility to appear in person at the Diet. This would be followed by a law in 1498 that added penalties for absentee nobles. The minor nobility was further strengthened in 1495 by a law that gave more power to the local assemblies of the nobility, to confirm or reject the decisions made by the royally appointed Ishpans and Zhupans, and the king was no longer allowed to grant those positions in perpetuity. Another law in 1495 struck at the church, limiting the authority of the papacy in the realm, and the nobility was given the right to collect their taxes before the church collected the tithe. Meanwhile, a wholly different development was taking place in Bohemia. The confessional conflict of the past was replaced with an economic conflict. Decades of civil war and unrest had drastically reduced the peasant workforce available, either because of death or the peasants fleeing to towns and cities. This, of course, drastically reduced noble estate incomes. Due to this, some nobles resorted to mercenary work or banditry. Others attempted to tie their peasants to the land. But some, especially the bigger landholders, tried to get in on lucrative enterprises. Ponds were constructed across estates in Bohemia so that nobles could profit off of selling fish. Others saw that they could muscle in on lucrative businesses that were legally in the purview of the urban guilds, specifically beer production. After all, they owned the land that made the ingredients. They could take them as their share of taxes from their peasants. All they needed was to open breweries, which they did, and with their noble privileges, no costs of ingredients, and tax exemptions, they could undercut the urban guilds and rake in the profits. And when the free royal cities protested and attempted to stop this economic encroachment, insisting on their liberties, the privileges of their guilds to give out licenses and ensure quality and control the prices, and the city's right to tax incoming and outgoing goods, the nobles simply set up their own little market towns. And slowly the Bohemian nobility, no longer divided by confession, united to curb the economic and political privileges of the free royal cities, while the cities themselves realized that they were now outnumbered in the Diet. Where once they had confessional allies, were now their economic and political adversaries. The diets held throughout the 1490s, dominated by the minor nobility trying to secure their meager incomes, steadily stripped the rights and protections from the free peasantry and implemented policies that would slowly and systemically institute serfdom across the realm. Peasants' freedoms of movement were steadily restricted, no longer allowing peasants to move their whole families and households to other estates. This was done in order to make sure that peasants could not easily get away from unfavorable conditions, while other measures were found to further exploit the peasants who lived in more favorable conditions. It may sound strange to some, but most of the 15th century was not a bad time economically for the peasantry, and there were some peasants that were better off than members of the minor nobility. This was partially due to the taxes being collected in coin, because peasants realized that they could sell their goods at markets at prices that would meet their needs, pay their taxes, and leave a little bit more. In the realm of St. Stephen, the richest peasants were those who traded in wine and livestock. Near the end of the 15th century, landowners caught on to this, and in need of money themselves, they began to change their taxes, demanding that peasants pay in nature or goods produced, rather than in money, as was the old practice. Because then the nobility could sell the goods themselves, and using their privileges of exemptions from taxes and tolls, they could garner greater profits. This change really took off after the death of King Matthias and the expansion of the nobility's judicial and economic rights and privileges. The diets, held from 1492 to 1500, all expanded the legal definition of taxable goods, to include everything that the peasantry could produce, and also expanded the peasant's labor obligation on the lord's personal land. New laws forbade the peasantry from independently engaging in some profitable activities, like the export of livestock and hunting. Children of peasants were barred from positions in the administration and from becoming judges. Peasants were now required to ask for permission from their lord or their local authorities to move estates, while landowners who took in fleeing peasants could be legally prosecuted. Now, during the 1490s and the 1500s, the courts tended to show mercy and allowed peasants to move from cruel and harsh conditions. This was, of course, to the benefit of the nobility that tended to preside over the courts, as they saw that they could attain more of the fleeing peasantry for their own estates with public displays of kindness. The legalistic onslaught on the peasants, of course, caused collateral damage. The rights and protections of the Kuman and Szekel communities in Hungary and Transylvania were eroded, and many of their poorer members were now looked upon as mere peasants. In theory, all these new restrictions, the increased taxes and labor obligations on the peasantry, combined with direct sales of goods on the market, should have increased the revenues of the nobility, in order to pay for the increased defense, rebuilding, soldiers, and other expenses. But with everything they made subject to taxation, with their movements, trade, and advancement restricted, the peasantry no longer saw any incentive to do more than the bare minimum demanded of them. Thus, the economic system slowly became more vulnerable to failed harvests and raids. And with a very decentralized taxation system in which people collecting the taxes were incentivized to skim off of the funds as they went up the chain, it meant that the funds arriving into the local and royal treasuries were very diminished. So there were little to no funds for emergency situations, like when the money to pay soldiers ran out. So those soldiers turned to banditry, and further devastated the local area. This exact problem was noted in areas of Transylvania. When this system, advocated for by the minor nobility, failed to improve the situation, the blame was laid on the lazy peasantry and the incompetent and corrupt magnates and royal councillors, who were also blamed for not doing enough about the Ottoman threat. Some even dared to blame the foreigner on the throne. The magnates had, of course, approved all of the mentioned reforms, as they were also to their benefit, but that did not stop them from being viewed negatively by the minor nobility. The Diet of 1496 removed the royal treasurer on charges of embezzlement. The following year, 1497, they went after the source of all evil, Chancellor Thomas Bakach, and the angry estates at the Diet succeeded in removing him. However, the king replaced Bakach with Bakach's protege, Royal Secretary George St. Mary. The same year, Bakach was also appointed as the new Archbishop of Esztergom, after the previous holder, the young Cardinal Hippolyte d'Este, was made Archbishop of Milan. Bakach was also soon returned to his functions as Chancellor. Hostilities with the Ottoman Sultan renewed in 1498, and the Diet made an attempt at military reforms that harkened back to the days of King Sigismund. By the new law, the magnates and high office holders were required to equip sizable forces of armored horsemen, while all other nobles were required to equip forces of archers, depending on the size of their estates. They also needed to contribute to a municipal effort to hire armored infantrymen for their county. Nobility in the bordering regions were required to equip light cavalry forces, again proportional to the size of their estates. While the reforms did provide military obligations and organization, they also further stratified society, drawing a line between the magnates and the other nobility. A similar reform was also instituted in Bohemia. The renewal of hostilities and the intensification of raids on the border aggravated the deteriorating internal economic and political situation. Because of the failures of the Royal Council to correct course internally and a lack of any great effort to aggressively deal with the Ottoman menace once and for all, the rich and powerful were being called adherents of the Antichrist. And at the Diet of 1499, a group of minor nobles erected a gallows near to the site of the Diet. But these internal tensions eased by the following year. In late 1499, an alliance with Venice against the Ottomans was being negotiated, and at the same time, Palatine Stephen Zápolya died, and his national party splintered. Stephen Zápolya's large estates were inherited by his young sons Janos and George. In other news, around the turn of the century, the king's marriage annulment proceedings ended, with Pope Alexander VI granting the annulment. Former Queen Consort Beatrice of Naples was forced to move back to Naples, where she died in 1508. In the 1490s, there was an additional line in the letters from the Ottoman Sultan to the nobility on the border of the realm of St. Stephen. They were advised to surrender, because no help would be coming. All of the Christian powers were too busy fighting each other in Italy. When King Charles VIII of France made his incursion into Italy in late 1494 to claim the throne of Naples and allegedly lead a crusade against the Turk, he set off a chain of events that broke the regional balance of power and began a decades-long conflict for hegemony over the Apennine Peninsula known as the Italian Wars, which I will very fortunately not be covering in its entirety, as the whole complicated course of events far surpasses the complexity that was the outbreak of World War I. Within a few months of his incursion, King Charles of France reached Naples, with every prince, duke, pope, and king getting out of his way. Behind him he left a line of fortresses waving French flags, a trail of devastation caused by his army, and among many other things, a Florence ruled by a bonfire-happy fanatic called Savonarola, who condemned the corruption of the temporal world and the Holy Mother Church. The speed of the French advance shook many, including the imperial divan in Constantinople, which sued for peace with King Wladislav II of Hungary and Croatia and reinforced its fortresses in Albania. But in the spring of 1495, King Charles of France, and now of Naples, suddenly found himself isolated in southern Italy. The other Italian polities and a few external actors recovered from their shock and formed an alliance in Venice against the interloper and his formidable army. Everyone was afraid of a continual strong French presence on the peninsula. King Maximilian von Habsburg justified his presence in the alliance through his marriage to Bianca Sforza, the niece of the new Duke of Milan, who barely saved his duchy in the initial French incursion and now wanted his fortresses back. King Ferdinand of Aragon either wanted to restore his cousin to the throne of Naples or take it for himself. While the host of this alliance, the Republic of Venice, had ironically called King Charles VIII to invade Naples a decade earlier, but the situation had changed significantly since, and now a French dynasty was again threatening Venetian trade with a probable seizure of both sides of the Strait of Otranto. As one Venetian diplomat put it, Venice wants to choose its allies, not suffer them. Cut off in Naples and with France now under threat, King Charles VIII decided to pursue a difficult journey back to France. He and his army made it, battered and bruised but not defeated. Almost as soon as Charles had left Naples, Venice helped restore King Ferrante II to his throne, in exchange for control over several Apulian ports, which would only be returned as soon as King Ferrante paid his substantial debts. The situation in Italy was not given time to settle. King Charles VIII had died in 1498, but his cousin and successor, Louis XII of France, invaded Italy again in 1499 to conquer the Duchy of Milan, this time with the help of Venice and the Pope's son, Cesare Borgia. Venice took over the valuable city of Cremona and did little else to help its allies. However, it was facing a crisis on other fronts. Ottoman forces were threatening the remaining Venetian bases in the eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman raids passing through Croatia terrorized the Adriatic coastal communes, and the Ottoman fleet almost put a halt to Venetian shipping out of the Adriatic. Worrying news also arrived from the west. In 1499, Vasco da Gama returned from his voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, and spices bought and sold cheaper than anything Venice could buy in Egypt began to flow into Lisbon. With its overseas empire in danger, its trade routes raided, its market dominance fleeting, expansion and security of Venetian holdings in mainland Italy, its so-called terra firma, became a priority. Venice could no longer rely on the turbulent waves of trade, but needed a reliable economic base close to home. This of course meant that some areas of the Venetian overseas empire, its so-called Stato da Mar, were left with less than satisfactory defenses. The Bishop of Trogir begged the Venetian Senate for more aid and reinforcements, describing the horrors of the Ottoman raids outside the walls of the Adriatic communes. It was sometime during this period that the Croatian author Marko Marulić of Split probably wrote the verses to his prayer against the Turk. Svemogi Bože moj, kim svaka postaju, odvrati ur gnjiv tvoj, ter pomiluj naju. Ostavi zlu voju, pozri na verni puk, di tarpi nevoju svak dan od turskih ruk. And in 1501 he wrote the Croatian epic poem Judita. Dike terfaljenja presveto Juditi, smina nje stvorenja hoću govoriti. It is based on the biblical story of Judith, who saved her besieged city by seducing and decapitating the invading Babylonian general, causing his army to flee. Marulić was of course linking the story to his contemporary situation, wanting to give hope that these dark and arduous times would also pass. Venice was looking for solutions to safeguard its Adriatic holdings, either from the Ottomans or some of the opportunistic Croatian nobility. The logical step was to pull King Wladislav II into its web of alliances. However, King Wladislav was hesitant. Joining an alliance fighting the Duke of Milan could cause a conflict with Maximilian von Habsburg. To convince Wladislav, the Venetian allies, King Louis of France and King Ferdinand of Aragon, offered military aid and an alliance via marriage to their cousin Anne of Foix, while Pope Alexander VI and Venice offered to increase their monetary aid. Venice specifically offered a continual yearly payment of 100,000 florins a year during wartime and 30,000 florins a year during peacetime. And to internally push the king into the alliance, Chancellor Thomas Bakac, the Archbishop of Esztergom, was allegedly bribed with a cardinal's hat. The alliances were formalized between 1499 and 1501. Wladislav married Anne of Foix in 1502, but by 1502 several castles in Bosnia had been lost. Venice lost holdings in Albania and a strip of territory in Dalmatia near Makarska. Few victories were won in the Ionian, and Ban John Corvinus fought off the Ottomans at Knin and Jajce. The war was once again stopped by other events. The Ottoman Empire was attacked from the east and the Sultan sued for peace. The peace with Venice was made in December of 1502, and a 7-year peace was made with King Wladislav in 1503. This of course did not stop the border raids. After the death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503, Venice started making inroads into Papal Romagna, where Cesare Borgia had been trying to carve out a realm of his own. Since the start of the Italian Wars, Venice had slowly but noticeably grown its territory, while its allies did most of the fighting. It did not take long for people to notice and to come to the conclusion that they may have been played, as Venice was now on the road to hegemony in northern Italy. To close today, John Corvinus died in 1504 in Krapina from an illness that by some stories he contracted while defending either Knin or Jajce. He was buried in the church of the Pavlinian monastery in Lepoglava. His 5-year-old son Christopher was buried near him in 1505. Their graves were opened recently in 2021 as part of a Hungarian research project. He was followed by John's newborn son Matthias, who died after only a few months. And the last of the Hunyadi line, John's 12-year-old daughter Elizabeth Corvinus, died in 1508, soon after her engagement to George Zapoля. John Corvinus's wife, Beatrice Frankopan, went on to marry George Hohenzollern, the son of the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, but she also died in 1510. The three royal cities of the realms of St. Wenceslas and St. Stephen were fortified centers of population, trade, and manufacture, legally under the direct protection of the crown. They had their own rights, liberties, privileges, laws, and taxes, and their own representation at the diets of the estates. Their citizens were subject to their laws on their land, and the cities insisted on the same laws applying over their inhabitants and visitors. Three royal cities were thus attractive to peasants and serfs seeking refuge from feudal abuses, and all the things mentioned greatly annoyed the city's feudal neighbors. What the cities lacked was political power outside of their own walls. At the diets of the estates, their representatives were greatly outnumbered by the nobility, and in this era of a politically ascendant nobility, the full legislative power of the diets was turned against the rights, liberties, and privileges of the free royal cities. In the realm of St. Stephen, new laws were passed that no tax or toll could be levied against nobility, not even by the free royal cities, which tended to impose tolls and market taxes on everyone. Laws were passed that said that anyone who wasn't an official citizen of a free royal city was subject to the laws of the municipality or county that the city was located in, not the city's own laws. It was also declared that the cities were subject to local taxes imposed by the local assemblies of the nobility. This, of course, caused tensions, but in the realm of St. Stephen, the cities were far too weak and too spread out to mount any sort of resistance, and King Wladislav II did not seem willing or able to protect his cities. The situation was different in Bohemia. The cities there were in greater numbers, more populated, interconnected, wealthier, and influential. Similar legislative efforts to curb the power and rights of the cities were stopped at the diets of Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia by agreements between the estates. The exception was the Diet of Bohemia proper, which passed King Vladislav's land ordinance of the year 1500. Along with some general matters, like the subordination of the crown in some aspects to the will of the Diet, and the Diet reaffirming its own rights to pass laws and regulations, the land ordinance also included measures that curtailed the voting power of the free royal cities in the Diet and subordinated the cities to the noble-run regional land courts. In response to the land ordinance, the Bohemian free royal cities sent a delegation to King Wladislav in Buda, demanding that the offending sections of the law be removed. But King Wladislav, again unwilling and unable to defy the Diet, followed the advice of his councillors and simply confirmed the land ordinance in 1502. With no legal recourse open to them, the free royal cities of Bohemia began militarizing. Conflicts erupted for real or imagined offenses between the nobility and burghers. Skirmishes began to occur and slowly escalated. Land and trade was raided. Nobles, subjects, and citizens were killed. And both sides asserted their right to legally and severely punish the other for any violations. As one of his realms was slowly descending into potential civil war, King Wladislav II was watching as the other one put his rule in jeopardy. Janos Zapoля, the eldest son of the former Palatine Stephen Zapoля, and now one of the biggest landholders in the realm, came of age and made his political debut at the Diet of 1505. Most of his father's supporters rallied around him, and Zapolya once again commanded the largest faction at the Diet. With Janos Zapolya's sponsorship, Stephen Verbotsy, a minor noble, legal scholar, and orator, proposed a new law, which condemned to treason and eternal serfdom anyone who proposed a foreigner as successor to the throne. Verbotsy accused foreign rulers of the past of bringing nothing but ruin and oppression through their ignorance of Hungarian traditions, while kings of Hungarian birth, like Louis I and Matthias I Corvinus, enhanced the glory and fame of the nation through their deeds. Whether this was an attack on King Wladislav is debated. By the criteria of King Louis I, any of Wladislav's children would be considered Hungarian. But the problem was just that. Wladislav was now 49 and had no male heir. He and Queen Anna did have a daughter in 1503, but nobody was considering Princess Anna as a viable candidate. What the law was clearly attacking was the Habsburg succession agreement. By the law, after Wladislav died, an internal candidate would have to be found. Someone who perhaps had the support of many members of the Diet. It has also been alleged that the anti-Habsburg factions in the estates had been receiving support from King Władyslav's brothers, John Albert, Alexander, and Sigismund, all kings of Poland-Lithuania successively. They wanted to keep the Habsburgs off of their brother's throne, keep their southern border safe, and keep their own options open. The law of 1505 had passed the Diet, but on this matter, King Wladislav stood firm in a cemented position. He never signed off on the law, never gave his assent, and maintained through his future actions that no such law was in force, while the proponents of the law maintained that the law was in force just through its passage in the Diet. Legislative procedure had not been exactly defined, and we were in the midst of an era where those norms could and did change. What the passage of the law did cause was what Wladislav had feared. Maximilian von Habsburg prepared for a military campaign to enforce the succession agreement. Fortunately for Wladislav, the situation very quickly de-escalated when on the 1st of July, 1506, Queen Anne gave birth to Prince Louis. Sadly, Queen Anne died soon after the birth. King Wladislav and Maximilian met in Vienna on the 19th of July, 1506, and signed a new treaty, reaffirming the Habsburg succession to the realms of St. Stephen and St. Wenceslas, in case Wladislav and Louis died without male heirs. It was also agreed that Władyslav's daughter, Princess Anna, would marry Maximilian's grandson, Ferdinand. The reaffirmation of the Habsburg succession in defiance of the law of 1505 caused an uproar in the Diet, with a minority of nobles refusing to recognize Prince Louis as heir. Wladislav was again forced to make concessions to appease the Diet, giving it and the royal council more control over royal appointments. There was movement on all of the issues mentioned today in the year 1508. The Bohemian nobility relented and returned the old voting rights to the Bohemian free royal cities, but tensions remained over the judicial question and violations of trade rights and guild rights, especially beer production, while the free royal cities of the realm of St. Stephen saw that they were not being listened to and could do little at the Diet. They withdrew their representatives from the Diets for the foreseeable future. And on the 4th of June, 1508, King Wladislav made a demonstration of who was still the boss when it came to the succession. He had young Prince Louis crowned with the Holy Crown of Hungary at Székesfehérvár by the Archbishop of Esztergom. A year later, Louis would also be crowned in Prague. Also, in 1508, a son was born to the Croatian noble Nicholas Šubić-Zrinski and his wife, Jelena Karlović, whom they named Nicholas. The most serene Republic of Venice faced big economic trouble in 1504. Lisbon was becoming the new European center of the spice trade. The prices of spices in Egypt, Venice's usual source, were increasing, due to Portuguese trade and piracy in the Indian Ocean, and spice merchants were leaving Venice due to even higher prices. Since they couldn't sail around the Cape of Good Hope due to fears of renewed Ottoman aggression, the proud and cunning Venetian merchants did the only thing they could. They all but groveled before the Egyptian Sultan, begging him to reduce prices. They even offered to build a canal that would connect the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The Sultan said no. Since the Venetians weren't buying as much anymore, he saw no reason to oblige them. So for the first time in centuries, the Venetian spice fleet came back from Egypt empty. The Venetians hoped that the situation would fix itself and they could avoid buying spices from the Portuguese. But things only got worse. By 1507, Portugal had attained control of Socotra and Hormuz at the entrances to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, further redirecting trade to their own trade ports and around the Cape. Not only that, the Portuguese also began to proactively sell spices at other European ports, meaning that many merchants no longer had to travel and pay extortionate fees to conduct trade in other cities, like Venice. Still, Venice held out some hope that they could avoid bowing to the Portuguese spice monopoly. Venice had economic security thanks to its recently expanded terra firma in northern Italy. It had grown the territory mostly through diplomatic cunning. While others thought, Venice expanded at minimum cost to itself, which was noticed. In early 1508, King Maximilian von Habsburg of Germany demanded safe passage through Venetian territory in order to be crowned emperor by Pope Julius II in Rome. Venice, suspecting that Maximilian was bringing more than just a small entourage, refused. Pope Julius then sent a document to Maximilian declaring him to be the emperor sans coronation, breaking centuries of precedent. The Venetian refusal caused the war, which cost Maximilian Trieste. But either through Venetian diplomatic bungling or inevitability, other interested parties soon joined the war to cut Venice down to size. In late 1508, Pope Julius, King Louis XII of France, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and now Naples, Emperor Maximilian I, and other Italian polities formed the League of Cambrai against Venice. It is said that when the Venetian ambassador to Rome was given the declaration of war, Pope Julius said, "We will turn Venice into a fishing village." To which the Venetian ambassador replied, "And we will turn you into the village priest." For all the diplomatic bluster, the war turned catastrophic for Venice. In fact, it was effectively lost after the Venetian defeat at the Battle of Agnadello on the 14th of May 1509. As news spread of the defeat, Venetian control of terra firma collapsed. Retreating Venetian soldiers were not allowed into their own cities and fortifications anymore. The patrician councils across terra firma declared independence or allegiance to either King Louis or Emperor Maximilian. Venice itself was in a panic, preparing for a siege. But suddenly, something completely unexpected happened. The commoners and peasants of the Venetian terra firma rose up in arms, and with the shouts of "Marco, Marco!" attacked the invading soldiers, and with the help of Venetian forces they put their own cities under siege, and demanded that the patrician councils remain loyal to Venice, which they acquiesced to. This miracle allowed Venice to regain control of much of terra firma very quickly, and Venice itself was saved. One explanation as to why the lower orders did this was that they believed that their lives would only get worse if their patricians were no longer subject to Venetian regulation and administration. This unusual series of events bought Venice time, and allowed it to pursue a course of frantic concessionary diplomacy. They appeased the King of Aragon in Naples by giving him the Apulian ports they acquired in 1495. The Pope had also grown worried about the strong French presence in Italy, so Venice offered to return the territories it had taken in Papal Romagna in exchange for an alliance against France. But at the same time as Venice was turning its diplomatic situation around, Emperor Maximilian was trying to convince King Wladislav II to join the league against Venice. Wladislav had the opportunity to take Dalmatia from Venice, and was told that if he didn't, Maximilian would. The problem was that Wladislav was on the fence, as was his royal council. A war with Venice, though seemingly beneficial, would draw resources away from the Ottoman front, and put an end to any aid that Venice was giving Wladislav's realm. The decision was thus put to the Diet. In 1510, when the geopolitical situation in Italy had drastically altered, and the Pope was now allied with Venice against France. At the Diet, Cardinal Baccac led the pro-Venetian side. He was allegedly assured that Venice would support him at the next papal election if he quashed the war effort. The pro-Venetian side pointed to the fact that Venice was financing the anti-Ottoman defense, and that it made far more strategic and ideological sense to join forces against the Ottomans instead of participating in a war that would weaken everyone. There was also the fact that the peace with Sultan Bayezid was about to run out in 1510, and Ottoman incursions were expected. The most vocal on the anti-Venetian side was cleric and royal secretary Peter Berislavich of Trogir, who despised Venetian rule over his hometown. He urged on the war, saying that right now, with Venice on the back foot, all they needed to do was send a small army to knock on the door of the coastal communes, and they would all simply surrender to King Wladislav. The Diet in the end decided by a small majority in favor of the war against Venice. King Wladislav appointed commanders for the war effort, among whom were Croatian noble Ivan Karlović and the new voivode of Transylvania Janos Zapolja, both of whom had distinguished themselves in service on the border. But despite all that, there seems to have been no war effort. This was due to either no money being allocated towards it, or because the nobility, especially the Croatian nobility, refused to go to war with Venice. They wanted to focus on the Ottoman border. Venice and its ally the Pope had for years now been providing for the Croatian defense. Ivan Karlović himself received money from Venice as a condottieri. Even nobles that had interests to attack Venice, like Bernardin Frankopan, who wanted to take back his old familial possession of Krk, was far more concerned about the Ottoman threat. He did, however, allow his son to fight in Emperor Maximilian's armies in the slim hope that Krk could be returned that way. This whole situation appears to have ignited strong sentiments among the Croatian nobility, as some even floated the idea of ending the union with Hungary and pledging loyalty to either Venice or Maximilian. So in the end, Cardinal Baccac was able to inform the Venetians that there would be no war, and asked Venice to continue providing funds for the Ottoman front, while Peter Berislavich was dispatched to explain to Emperor Maximilian why King Wladislav was not actually going to war. Fortunately, the geopolitical situation had shifted once again during this time, and Maximilian was soon fighting with Venice and the Pope against the King of France. After facing almost certain doom in the War of the League of Cambrai and the loss of some of its mainland possessions, Venice soon relented and began buying spices from the Portuguese. So I spent 2 episodes of a series about King Wladislav II of Bohemia, Hungary and Croatia talking about the early Italian wars, and the apparent conclusion is that nothing of relevant consequence happened. Well, yes, but things could have happened, and there is still more to this story. Pope Julius's over-involvement in matters temporal, like the Italian wars, displeased a good portion of the clergy. After the Holy League formed against King Louis XII of France in 1511, a portion of the cardinals departed Rome and gathered for a council in Pisa, which condemned Pope Julius as the disruptor of the peace of Christendom. To avoid another schism in the Holy Mother Church, Pope Julius quickly summoned a General Church Council to meet in Rome the following year, at the Lateran, with the official aim to address the internal problems and reform of the Church and unify Christendom against the Ottoman threat. King Wladislav II sent royal secretary and cleric Peter Berislavich to Rome to negotiate on both the terms of the council and the anti-Ottoman alliance. It is said that his visit to Rome softened Berislavich's anti-Venetian stance, and he realized the greater Ottoman threat. Coincidentally, upon his return to Buda, the king and Cardinal Bakac made Berislavich the Bishop of Veszprém, and appointed him administrator of the Hospitalier Priorate of Vrana, and gave him a role in the royal treasury. Incidentally, around the same time, the Diet also made a law that the royal treasury could no longer unilaterally declare extraordinary taxes, but needed approval of 2 other officials appointed by the Diet. But I digress. In early 1512, King Wladislav was informed that Sultan Bayezid was open to another 7-year peace. This came after the Ottomans had chipped away at Vladislav's defenses, taking fortifications along the valley of the river Neretva. But any prospect of this peace soon disappeared when Sultan Bayezid was overthrown by a Janissary revolt, led by his son Selim, who was made the new sultan. And he was far less keen on peace. Coincidentally, soon after this sultanic succession, Pope Julius II opened the Lateran Council in May of 1512. At the council, Archbishop Bernardin Zane of Split warned the Church Fathers that they should not feel safe just because they live far away from the Turks. If you leave your neighbor's house on fire, then your other neighbor will leave you when yours catches fire. But the Archbishop's warnings were not heeded. The council went on debating and discussing matters of church reform, while Pope Julius focused on the Italian situation and anti-French coalition building. As the council dragged through 1512, the situation on the Ottoman front deteriorated. The key fortress of Srebrenik fell to the Ottomans, along with others. Several fortifications in the area of the Cetina River were also conquered. The fortress of Sinj, which is said to have been manned by 5 men, was only saved because the Cetina River flooded and prevented an Ottoman siege, but it would fall in the following years. The defense of the realm of St. Stephen was fragmenting. The central authorities struggled to coordinate a joint defense, as the estates wanted to defend their own lands and areas of interest. The problem was acute in Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, with successive Bans struggling to get the Croatian and Slavonian estates to cooperate. A new Ban was appointed in 1513, Bishop Peter Berislavich, who managed to get the Croatian and Slavonian estates to assemble a joint army and repel the Ottomans near Dubica on the Una. At the same time, on the other side of the realm, Stephen Batory also defeated an Ottoman incursion. I would like to note that there are at least 2 Stephen Batorys alive at this time, and I don't know which Stephen Batory the books are referring to in this instance. Back in Rome, the Lateran Council continued into 1513, when it was interrupted by the passing of Pope Julius II. Cardinal Bakac finally saw his chance to become the next heir of St. Peter, and he drew upon all of his diplomatic skill, connections, and influence, and was rewarded with 8 votes on the first ballot, short of the required 17. After negotiations, Bakac joined with other cardinals to elect Giovanni Lorenzo di Medici as the new Pope Leo X. The new pope was far more inclined to support anti-Ottoman efforts. He quickly authorized more funds to be sent to the realm of St. Stephen, and he also named Cardinal Bakac as papal legate and authorized him to proclaim a crusade, in the hopes that the rulers of Europe could join together in common cause for the sake of Christendom. Bakac departed the council for Buda to begin preparing the groundwork for the crusade. The Lateran Council would go on for a few more years, closing in early 1517. It would end in disappointment, with few if any of the discussed reforms put into practice, and without addressing many prominent concerns, notably the matter of indulgence payments. In Hungary, Bakac presented the crusading bull to the Diet in early 1514. He asked the estates of the realm to join a new crusade against the Ottomans. The estates refused. Bakac decided to go ahead with the crusade anyway. He appears to have thought that if he mobilized the people who were in favor of the crusade, others would follow. All the churches and preachers across the realm repeated the cardinal's call. Some minor nobility began to assemble near Pest, along with tens of thousands of peasants, who were encouraged to join the Crusader army by Franciscan friars. The mass of peasants grew steadily through April of 1514. It didn't take long for the nobility of the realm to notice that their peasants were leaving their lands, so they tried to stop them, which led to conflicts between the nobles and their peasants. Soon other peasants began refusing to work or pay their dues in protest of not being allowed to go on crusade, or because they couldn't do the work without the people who left on the crusade. By refusing to fight in a crusade, that is, perform their highest duty, the nobility was losing the moral authority it had over the peasantry, who were now, encouraged by the priesthood, taking up arms and refusing to carry out their duty since the nobility wasn't doing theirs. One could say that the entire feudal societal order was about to break apart at its seams. Among the growing crusading army there were a few warriors, knights and minor nobles who assumed commanding positions. One of them was a Siekel warrior, George Doja, who had experience fighting the Ottomans at the fortress of Belgrade under Janos Zapoля. He was soon recognized as the commander of a great portion of the peasant crusaders, and under his command, around the 9th of May, the mass of peasants began moving southwards. It didn't take long for the army to run into problems as the peasants had no supplies. So as they marched, they plundered. Parts of the army also ran into groups of nobles who were attempting to return their peasants back to work. The peasants refused, and conflicts erupted. The estates of the realm assembled at Buda demanding a response to the current situation, for which the blame was laid squarely on Cardinal Bakac, who was all but forced to order the cessation of the crusade on the 15th of May. This was followed on the 24th of May by King Wladislav II issuing an order for the peasant crusaders to disperse and return to their homes. Word of Bakac's order angered the peasants, who decided to continue the crusade. On the 22nd of May, the bulk of Doja's army encountered a force led by Stephen Batory and Bishop Nicholas Sasaki of Cenad. A portion of the peasant force was routed, but soon after the noble force was ambushed and Bishop Nicholas captured. When word arrived of the king's order to disperse, Doja had Bishop Nicholas and a few other captured nobles impaled. The attempts to stop the peasant crusade had turned it into a rebellion. As word spread, more peasants rose up all over the Pannonian basin, some led by priests and friars, others by very minor nobles, some by charismatic peasant leaders. Some destitute minor nobles with no peasants of their own also joined the rebellion. The growing rebellious mass put pressure on villages, castles, towns, and cities to make them surrender and join the rebellion, or they were ransacked. But all of these rebelling groups didn't coordinate with each other. There was no grand plan. This was an outpouring of anger and rage against a system that was putting more and more demands on the peasantry while failing to provide the promised security. The rebel Franciscans preached that by attempting to stop the crusade, the lords had forfeited their rights. Thus the rebels attacked feudal holdings, castles, manor houses, churches, monasteries, with the aim of destroying feudal records, contracts, and other documents that recorded the peasants' feudal obligations and were used to justify their workloads and burdens before the law. The only peasant force that seemed to have had some sort of plan appears to have been under the command of George Doja. At the beginning of June, they were raiding noble holdings and besieging castles in the region of Srem. Then, Doja turned the army eastwards towards Temishvar, laying siege to it on the 13th of June. Another part of Doja's army, or another rebel army entirely, under the command of a friar named Lawrence, went north and occupied Varad. The intent appears to have been to spread the rebellion to Transylvania. Why this course of action was chosen is not exactly known. Transylvania was very defensible, and part of its population had reason to be resentful of the powers that be. Policies in Transylvania already divided its three constituent nations, and when Prince Louis was born in 1506, a celebratory tax led to an uprising in the Sekil population, which was suppressed by the Hungarian nobility and the Transylvanian Saxon burghers. A year later, the Sekils would retaliate against the Saxons. The appointment of Janos Zápolya as voivode of Transylvania in 1510 was initially welcomed by the Sekils, as he was a figure in opposition to the king and his advisors. But Zápolya put no effort into solving Transylvania's internal divisions, leaving things largely as they were. Thus some historians speculate that Doja, himself a Sekil, wanted to bring the Sekils into the rebellion. Others don't think this would have worked, as the Sekils saw themselves as equals of the nobility and would not have found common cause with mere peasants. Back in Buda, the royal council was panicking. King Wladislav is reported to have been numbed into inaction from the shock. A general levy of the nobility was proclaimed but would take time to assemble. At the very least, the rebels had been chased away from the Buda and Pest area. In Transylvania, Voivode Zápolya and the estates of Transylvania were able to coordinate the defense fairly quickly, as they had assembled for a diet on the 18th of June. Voivode Janos Zápolya took one army to relieve Temishvar, while the vice-voivode led a second army to relieve Cluj, which had been surrounded by Friar Lawrence's army. Cluj had opened its gates to Friar Lawrence and his officers, but under the condition that the rest of the army stay outside. When the relief force reached Cluj around the 10th of July and began fighting the peasants, the Cluj town guards used the opportunity to assassinate a great number of the peasant officers, not including Friar Lawrence, who was outside with the army at that moment. Friar Lawrence's army was forced to retreat and slowly disintegrated. Janos Zápolya engaged, defeated, and captured George Doja near Temishvar on the 15th of July. For leading the rebellion, treason against the kingdom, and attempting to upend the social order, Doja was forced to sit on a burning iron throne, crowned with a red-hot iron crown, and forced to hold a smouldering scepter, while his flesh was peeled from his body, and his lieutenants were forced to bite into it before being put to death themselves. As for the peasantry, some say that there was mass torture of peasants following the suppression of the rebellion. Others say that nothing happened to the peasants, who escaped capture and returned to work or did no crimes against their own lord, at least that nothing happened immediately. Following the rebellion, the peasants that engaged in it were royally pardoned, so that they wouldn't have to be executed for treason. Some peasants, for obvious reasons, couldn't return to their own lord's land, and instead fled to others, where they were accepted into the workforce. The Diet of the Realm assembled for a special session in October of 1514. For saving the realm, Janos Zápolya was awarded a significant amount of money. For inadvertently causing the rebellion, Cardinal Bakac was humiliated and forced out of politics. For the time. He would remain a private advisor to the king, and guardian and tutor of Prince Louis. Janos Zápolya already had great influence. In 1512 he got his younger sister Barbara married to King Władysław's brother, King Sigismund of Poland-Lithuania. And now rumors were circulating that Zápolya would be the one to marry King Władysław's daughter Anna. Zápolya also looked like he was on the cusp of attaining the office of Palatine, if not higher office. The Diet of October of 1514, of course now dominated with anti-peasant sentiment, laid out the punishment for the rebellion. Along with many other rights, the peasants' right to free movement was effectively revoked. The peasants had to pay for the damages caused by the rebellion. Their obligations towards their seniors were also increased. All peasants and their descendants were now tied to the land of its owners in perpetuity. The king was not allowed to raise peasants to the rank of bishop, and minor clerics were banned from carrying weapons except while traveling. It should be noted that Cardinal Bakac and other bishops created under King Matthias were peasants or other commoners. A very important book was also presented to the Diets of 1514. In 1505, the king had, under the direction of the Diet, charged Stephen Berbozzi with the task of writing a legal codex that contained the laws of the realm, which were previously written down in other documents or were part of the unwritten, customary and common law. Berbozzi's tripartitum was completed in 1514, just prior to the rebellion, and then amended. Split into 3 parts, the tripartitum Split into 3 parts, the tripartitum covered the subjects of the law and their legal relationships, legal procedure, and the miscellaneous collection of laws and legal matters. It condensed Berbozzi's interpretation of what the law and the constitutional order of the realm should be, and that put the whole of the nobility at the center of the system. The tripartitum claimed ancient origin of the legal and constitutional order from the Scythians and Huns. It emphasized the legal supremacy of the warrior nobility, who were the Hungarian people, the nation, and were all equal to each other. It outlined the reciprocal relationship between the nobility and their elected king, who needed no other intermediary to be made king, but the election by the nobility. For the king was but the first servant of the crown, and the crown was the holy embodiment of the nation. Thus the Diet of the nobility was the supreme authority in all matters, while the king's authority of approval and assent was recognized, as his power did come from the Diet. The tripartitum also emphasized the natural rights of the nobility over their subjects, with almost no obligations towards them. It repeated the nobility's exemption from paying taxes, and it reinforced that, If any of our princes and kings should venture to act contrary to the liberties of the nobles, then, as stated and expressed in the decree of the most illustrious prince, our former Lord King Andrew II, which decree every Hungarian king is wont to swear on oath to observe before the holy crown is placed on his head, they have for evermore the liberty to resist and oppose him without the charge of infidelity. But by Verbotzi's tripartitum, Hungarian law only applied to Hungary proper. Because we see that the long-established laws and customs of the kingdoms of Dalmatia, Croatia, Slavonija, and of Transylvania, which have long been subject to the Holy Crown, vary in certain terms and articles from the laws of our country, namely this Kingdom of Hungary, and they have the right to use and enjoy these customs, and are allowed, even now, with the prince's consent, to make statutes and ordinances among themselves. Nevertheless, they cannot establish any law in contravention of the general statutes and decrees of this Kingdom of Hungary. There are furthermore in Transylvania privileged nobles, originating from the Scythian people, whom we call by the name of Székely. They enjoy quite different laws and customs. They are very skilled in warfare, and they distribute inheritances and offices among themselves in the manner of the ancients. Now, the tripartitum was never sanctioned as law by the Diet, never received the royal seal. Its contents were interpreted by some to be unfavorable to the king, the magnates, and the clergy. So none of what I just told you became the official written law of the realm. But the tripartitum was later approved for use as a manual in the courts. Due to not being officially sanctioned, it was not printed by the state. Verbotzi had to finance the printing himself in Vienna in 1517. It allegedly became the second most popular book among the realm's nobility, next to the Bible. It had great influence on the practical side of the law, and the legal and constitutional education of the realm's nobility, including in Croatia and Transylvania. And while these events of 1514 were going on, the Ottomans attempted to take the Croatian royal fortress of Knin, but failed. At the Diet of the Estates of Slavonija in 1515, Ban Peter Berislavich called for the estates to join the Croatian army in the defense of the fortress of Jajce, which had come under siege by Ottoman forces. The estates of Slavonija refused, saying their duty was only to defend their kingdom, and they were under no obligation to spill blood for anything or anyone across the Sava. The Ban turned to King Wladislav II and Pope Leo X for aid. The king sent reinforcements from Bohemia and a very sternly worded letter to the estates of Slavonija. The Pope sent money and supplies and letters across Europe, asking other European rulers to help defend Jajce at this crucial hour. Enough help did arrive to keep the defense of Jajce holding, but the Ottomans were piling on the pressure there and elsewhere. The defensive system was barely holding them back. Without urgent reform, it was a matter of time as to when King Matthias's dam of fortresses would break. Back in Buda, the political swing swung back in favor of the king and the pro-Habsburg factions. Janos Zapolya's reputation suffered after a military defeat to the Ottomans in Serbia in April of 1515, and Emperor Maximilian was also hard at work lobbying for support inside the realm of St. Stephen. Maximilian had recently received the financial backing of the increasingly wealthy Fugger mining family, whose ascent began in the 1480s with the favor of the Habsburgs. So of course the Fuggers believed that Maximilian would be better suited to defend Europe against the Ottomans. They also owned parts of copper and silver mines in the realms of St. Stephen and Bohemia. The new political situation allowed King Wladislav to proceed with another reaffirmation of the Habsburg alliance, but this time involving the entire Jagiellon clan. King Wladislav II of Bohemia, Hungary and Croatia, Emperor Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire, and King Sigismund I of Poland-Lithuania met for talks in Vienna in mid-1515. Maximilian agreed to break his alliance with Grand Duke Vasily III of Moscow and Grand Master Albert of the Teutonic Order, who were threats to Poland-Lithuania. Sigismund agreed to stop supporting the anti-Habsburg factions in Vladislav's realm, and agreed to honor the Habsburg succession agreements. And Wladislav agreed to a double marriage between the Habsburgs and the Jagiellons. With everyone in agreement, a treaty was signed on the 19th of July 1515. It of course restated the previous succession agreements that Maximilian or his heirs would inherit the realms of St. Stephen and Bohemia if Wladislav or his male heirs were to die out. The new dynastic alliance was sealed on the 22nd of July, with the marriages of Wladislav's children Anna and Louis to Maximilian's grandchildren Ferdinand and Mary. This double marriage was insurance of a continual alliance should one of the marriages come to an untimely end. But it was also a gamble, and a similar sort of gamble made 2 decades prior had paid off for Maximilian more than he could have ever imagined at the time. In 1496, to ensure an alliance against France, Maximilian and King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile agreed to a double marriage between their children. Ferdinand and Isabella's second daughter, Joanna la Loca, was married to Maximilian's son and heir, Duke Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, while Ferdinand and Isabella's son and heir, Prince Juan of Asturias, was to marry Maximilian's daughter Margaret. Since both Maximilian and Ferdinand and Isabella had only one legitimate son, the double marriage was not only a possible lasting generational alliance, but a potential dynastic inheritance problem and opportunity. Maximilian was in a far more unfavorable position when these marriages were agreed to. Philip and Margaret were his only legitimate children. If Philip died before having an heir of his own, Margaret would be the inheritrix, and Prince Juan and his heirs would be set to inherit the Habsburg lands, almost wiping the Habsburg dynasty off the European stage. If on the other hand Prince Juan were to die, his elder sister Isabella of Aragon, Queen Consort of Portugal, would become heiress to Castile, the lands of the Crown of Aragon, and all their possessions in the New World, and any of her children would effectively unite the Iberian Peninsula and bring all of the Spanish and Portuguese overseas possessions under one crown. But the Habsburg possessions would stay with Philip and Joanna. After the marriages were made, Habsburg luck struck. Prince Juan of Asturias died in late 1497, allegedly because Margaret loved him too much. But others say the cause of death was actually tuberculosis or smallpox. A year later, 1498, Isabella of Portugal died soon after giving birth to a son, Miguel, and then Prince Miguel died in 1500. The same year, Philip and Joanna had a son, Charles. Joanna inherited the crown of Castile in 1504, after the death of Queen Isabella of Castile, and Philip became king through the right of his wife. Philip did die in 1506, driving Joanna further into her alleged madness. But the couple had done their duty. Along with Charles, they had Ferdinand, and 4 daughters, Eleanor, Isabella, Mary, and Catherine the Posthumous. To attempt to avert a complete loss of his dynasty to the Habsburgs, King Ferdinand of Aragon remarried to Germaine of Foix. They had only one son in 1509, but the baby John died within a few hours of his birth. Despite their best efforts, they had no other children. This means that at this point in 1515, the young Prince of Asturias, Charles von Habsburg of Ghent, was heir to the combined realms of Spain, Castile, Leon, Aragon, etc., Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, etc., Burgundy, the Low Countries, Upper and Lower Austria, Tyrol, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, possibly the Empire, and the expanding Spanish possessions in the New World. And with Charles set to inherit the mother-lode, I wouldn't put it past Maximilian that he now deliberately made the same gamble, but this time with better odds. Some of you may be wondering what happened to that brewing civil war in Bohemia. Well, long story short, in 1513 the cities formed a league to oppose the nobility's land ordinance by force if necessary, resulting in a tense stalemate between the opposing sides. King Wladislav intervened in 1515, and a negotiation process began until it reached a compromise agreement in 1517, known as St. Václav's Agreement. The nobility recognized separate urban judicial procedures, the cities recognized noble commercial practices, noble-owned towns removed restrictions on their markets, and the cities gave the nobility the rights to produce beer for 6 years. The nobility did not give it up when the date came. In February of 1516, Pope Leo X sent a letter to Buda, saying that King Wladislav should not make any peace with the Ottomans, for the new King of France, Francis I, decided to join the war. Whether or not this would have turned out to be true, any potential war plans were soon set aside, because Wladislav II Jagiellon, King of Bohemia, Hungary, Dalmatia, Croatia, Slavonia, Rama, Serbia, Galicia, Lodomeria, Cumania, and Bulgaria, Prince of Silesia and Luxembourg, Margrave of Moravia and of Upper and Lower Lusatia, died on the 13th of March, 1516. He was succeeded by his already crowned 10-year-old son, King Louis II. It is said that during the period of Władyslav's rule, and 10 years following his death, more acts were passed by the Diet of the Realm of St. Stephen than had been in the 500 years before. Wladislav II was by and large a constitution-abiding monarch. One might call him a constitutional monarch, to coin a phrase. His reign saw developments of constitutionalism, parliamentarianism, proto-nationalism. It saw changes to the estate-based economic barriers. It saw the breakdown in the social contract and the institutionalization of serfdom. It saw the emergence of a new geopolitical order in Europe and the discovery of a new world and the beginning of a new age. In the realm of Bohemia, these political and economic developments almost caused the second civil war in a century, had not cooler heads prevailed. While in the realm of St. Stephen, Władyslav's reign saw a particularist, reactionary, ideologically driven model of idealized, decentralized, medieval feudal government direct the realm towards economic, social, and military collapse in the face of an existential threat.